Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest from Kyiv is Mykola Bielieskov. He is security analyst at the Ukrainian Institute for Strategic Studies. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Mykola, please tell us, we're now all waiting for the Ukrainian offensive. We don't know where it happened and how, but we are all waiting for it. And recently, the Russians have blown up the dam of Nova Kakhovka water reservoir. How can it affect the offensive? And does it have any real big meaning for the offensive?
Well, I don't think that it would have a major impact. Definitely, it's a major catastrophe. It's a breach of humanitarian law. It's with all the negative consequences. But if you are talking about strictly military implication, in my opinion, they would be minor one for a number of reasons. First of all, if Russians thought that by blowing the dam they might increase the width of the river and by this make crossing impossible, so sooner or later the water level will going to decrease. So that's why the width would also, I suppose, decrease to a certain extent. And I don't think that something major was planned over the Dnipro. So for sure, we did a lot of harassing actions. We did counter-battery fight, destroying Russian priority targets. But if there is anything related to counter-offensive to this Dnipro crossing, I think it would be a minor one, and it would be only complementary. So that's why if Russians saw that by blowing this dam, they would create insurmountable obstacles that would stop Ukrainian counteroffensive, they made a major mistake because nothing of bigger scale was planned. And if Ukrainians are successful elsewhere, only complementary action can be done over Dnipro when it would become obvious that Russian defense is shattered, that they are withdrawing. And now it's time to do another blow, minor one, to finally defeat Russians in southern mainland Ukraine, if it's indeed the target of the upcoming counteroffensive, and this is a mute point. I mean, there is a point of discussion. So that's hypothetical scenarios we are discussing right now.
But talking about the Ukrainian offensive, first, some people talk about offensive, some talk about counteroffensive. Could you elaborate on that? What are the targets? What are the objects of that? What are the goals? What can be hard for the Ukrainians to achieve? Where to expect it, and are we witnessing it right now?
Well, first of all, let me start from the opposite way. I mean, from the point of view of Russians, so we see major activity in terms of creating obstacles, in terms of creating engineering work for the so-called defensive in-depth. It's done in southern Ukraine. So Russians are most fearful of Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhia region and in Kherson region. So these parts of these two regions that are still temporarily occupied, because both Zaporizhia and Kherson are under firm Ukrainian control. So they are most fearful of this offensive in this sector. And indeed,
why is it so?
The stakes are high for the number of reasons. So first of all, it's an arable land. So if we can liberate parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson region, we need, of course, to do the mining. The second important thing is, of course, Zaporizhia nuclear power station, the biggest one in Europe, with 6 reactors. The situation very precarious one, as we see for many months, given the Russian actions in violation of everything related to nuclear reactor safety. So we need to liberate nuclear power plant because it's a source of energy, and we need to remove the threat of radioactive nuclear threat to the whole of Europe. And of course, if we are so successful with liberating mainland southern Ukraine, we would be at the isthmus of Crimea. It means that our negotiation position with regards to temporarily occupied Crimea by Russians would be strengthened. And we can employ both diplomacy and military means to strengthen our diplomatic position. So these are like economic stakes, strategic military stakes, also one of the reasons why Russians are very fearful, because they understand the stakes, because if we liberate Zaporizhia and Kherson region fully, it means that we would shorten the front line. It means lesser troops need to be kept on the front line. That's why there is this kind of reasons, but of course there are strategic reasons, and I suppose that strategic reasons are the most important ones. So Ukraine need to sustain the so-called positive cycle. So we do a progress at the front line. It means that more and more countries are ready to support us, and the support of the Western countries, which is the most important one, will endure, because everybody wants to be on a winner's side, and we need to produce results the same way as we produce in Kharkiv and Kherson. That's why the stakes are extremely high for a lot of reasons, and political military leadership of Ukraine understand it. They did the best in terms of mastering the equipment we were promised and delivered. But on the other hand, they understand that it can be postponed indefinitely. That's why we've had this statement by Supreme Commander-in-Chief Volodymyr Zelensky to Wall Street Journal, who said that despite the fact that we haven't received everything in terms of capability, but we can't postpone it indefinitely. And there was also a sign from Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, this video that we are going to recover territory. So I would say that precise timing is unknown, but counteroffensive is indeed upcoming.
When we are talking about the counteroffensive, the goals are clear, like to get the Russians out of Ukraine and to weaken them, but we don't know where it will take place. Can you describe the possible scenarios? You said like the southern part of Ukraine, but how should it look like? Like we read a lot of speculations about the Ukrainian army going straight to the Sea of Azov in Tokmak and Melitopol. Is this a possible scenario? Like it is pretty hard to cut through the defensive lines which the Russians have created there for over a year, or is it possible? Like we know that the Russian army is good in bragging and telling stories about how strong they are, but effectively they're not that strong. Or will it be another direction?
Well, there are precisely the issue of surprise we already discussed, and so there are different levels of surprise. There is strategic surprise, operational surprise, and tactical surprise. And maybe strategic surprise is missing in this kind of thing. So Russians are preparing in southern Ukraine, and well, for Ukraine it's also a very important direction, but still within this southern mainland Ukraine there is a number of directions. So you already mentioned a couple of directions, and that's why the surprise can be done at the operational level, so-called. There is indeed this Tokmak-Melitopol direction, there is direction towards Berdyansk, and there is direction towards Mariupol. So there is already three directions, and if we can do a classic offensive operation in any of these directions, it means that it would be successful. So by classic I mean, so first we penetrate so-called tactical depths of defense, and then we move in a follow-on echelon. We destroy logistics of the enemy, command and control, and make Russians flee. So despite the fact that Russians are waiting for Ukrainian counteroffensive in southern Ukraine, there is still a number of directions, number of ways where it can be done. And this is precisely the case when the initiative in the Ukrainian side, given the Russian losses in a failed second battle for eastern Ukraine. That's why we can create a preponderance of forces at certain places. And the Russians don't have this density of troops proportionate to the front line to create like the density like in World War I, for instance, especially at the Western Front, where it was indeed extremely difficult to quickly penetrate defenses. So we can create preponderance of forces and then try to do a classic offensive operation. So first, like penetrating, doing breakthrough in a depth of 10-15 kilometers, and then moving a second echelon. With regards to obstacles you mentioned, well, there is an adage that without people, these obstacles are meaningless. Without system of fire, these obstacles are meaningless. That's why, for sure, it's a problem for sure, it's a factor that we need to keep in mind to plan. That is the reason why our partners, including Germany, why they provide a different kind of engineering equipment, like to the mine territories, to do a land bridges makeshift, and so on. That's why without like people, proper amount of people, proper system of fire, these obstacles won't do Russia a major service. They envisioned, and I'm 100% sure when this operation was planned, that we planned not only our own action, but actions to Russian actions, I mean counter actions. So we think a couple of steps in advance, envisioning what Russian response would be, how they are going to respond proportionate to our actions. So I suppose we have like a list of actions we are going to employ towards Russian counteractions they are going to employ immediately. That's why I suppose we did our job greatly, like looking for the weaknesses in their front line, envisioning their countermeasures, and there are decent chances that all these obstacles they won't save Russians.
Oh, well, regarding the manpower, you mentioned that without soldiers, no defense line makes any sense, which is obvious. The Russians have lost allegedly up to 100,000 people in Bakhmut in attempts to occupy Bakhmut. Was it from this perspective a Russian strategic mistake to continue to try to take Bakhmut, and why did they deliberately want to take it?
Well, in this case, I can refer to a very famous Soviet-Russian military theorist, Alexander Svechin. In his brilliant book Strategy, he provided a lot of interesting sound ideas, and there is very good idea that relates directly to the situation how Russians employ their forces. I mean, in defensive, offensive mode. One of the most important tasks of the highest political military leadership is to reconcile the level of combat proficiency demonstrated by troops, real combat proficiency, with the tasks that are assigned. And it's clear in the last 15 months it was a difficult task for Russian political and military leadership, because it's quite obvious. It was even obvious before the second big battle for the eastern Ukraine that Russian combat proficiency is below the level that is required for classic offensive operation, with like enveloping major grouping of forces, destroying them, and so on, like we see in World War II. That's why it's, I would say, our big luck that Russians have good theoreticians but bad practitioners, and especially bad practitioners at the highest level of political and military leadership, that Vladimir Putin is not ready to live with the fact that armed forces of Russia, current armed forces, are incapable of major offensive, and all they can do now, at least try to do with more chances for success, is switch into defense. And it's our big luck that they spend 100,000 troops in vain, almost in vain, without no results, because otherwise imagine the situation if these troops were alive and this equipment also was present. It would make our counteroffensive more difficult. That's why these Russian mistakes at the highest level, it create opening for Ukraine. Surovikin indeed did a great job in terms of like stabilizing the situation, and then Russians, they did mobilizations, they increased the number of troops within the ranks, and Gerasimov and his close colleagues, they sold the idea that offensive is possible, especially as Putin, I suppose, still would like to see these territories they declared to be Russia to be occupied. At least that's the reason how it happened, and it's our great luck that Russians don't read, or at least don't follow, their best military theories.
Thank you. That is very important insight you have provided us with. But you have talked about the gap between the level of the Russian theoretical science and military science and the level of the practical implementation of it and the skills of the army, also the lack of good equipment. But what about the Ukrainian army? We see now that the Ukrainian army, which we observe today, is quite different to the Ukrainian army 2 years ago, or I'm not saying about 10 years ago. Can we talk today that the Ukrainian army is de facto fully compatible to the NATO standards?
Well, to tell the truth, I'm not a big fan of this so-called NATO standard talk, because I believe in the concept of the armed forces that are capable of doing a lot of things in tactical level. I mean, combined armed warfare, tactical level, at the operational level, and that's it. For sure, there are some requirements for interoperability, so-called interoperability. So the minimum requirements for the interoperability is not even the equipment we use, because we have the examples of the Central and Eastern European states that joined NATO, but still in the process of the transition. I mean, they at least had a lot of Soviet equipment, because the most important thing for any armed forces is to be able to do a combined armed warfare at the tactical and operational level. And to have this kind of so-called interoperability, you need to have communication equipment comparable so we can share information, share data. And you also need to have officers, first of all, officers at the middle and a high level who can operate using the same concept, using the same kind of doctrine. For sure, we did a major progress in all this kind of things. But in terms of secure communication equipment, I think we still need to do a major progress. And for sure, we need, like I would say, to merge Ukrainian experience, real world experience with NATO doctrines. But the most important thing, whether army can fight or can't fight. Ukrainian armed forces can fight. Well, the reason is very simple one. Unlike the Russians, which have authoritarian society, which don't have this kind of grassroots activity, improvisation, and so on, Ukrainians have a lot of experience from their previous life, like self-organizing, improvising, and so on. This is the reason why we're so successful. Of course, the level of motivation is different one, because for Ukrainian forces, it's a war of necessity. It's an existential fight. For Russians, it's very difficult to explain what they're fighting for. I mean, Russians are not buying in earnest the arguments provided by the Kremlin. That's why the level of motivation is lesser one. To sum it up, so the most important thing we demonstrate is that we can fight. We can fight both with Soviet equipment and with the NATO-provided equipment. And that's the most important thing, because no other NATO country can boast now the experience of high-intensity warfare, even the US, which for the last time fought a competitor of the lower level 20 years ago, state competitor. So our army is combat-proven. We relied on improvisation with ad hoc adjustments. So our mission command, I would say, in a lot of cases, it was not a result of a training we received from the NATO, we appreciate, but because there was no other reason, we can survive.
Thank you for this assessment. That regarding the quality of the Ukrainian army and its weaponry, we know that many people believe that certain types of weapons, which can be provided by the West, can be a total game changer and can win the war. And indeed, certain types of the weapons, like javelins or NLAWs in the early this full-scale invasion, they saved Kiev from being taken by the Russian armed columns. Or later, HIMARS did a lot of harm for the Russian logistics and made the life of Russian artillery very complicated. But can we say that there is like some wonder weapon, ultimate weapon, which can push the Russians away out of Ukraine?
Well, when people are framing the whole discussion in terms of ultimate weapon, they are making a major mistakes, because modern warfare is a combined armed warfare. So you need to combine a lot of things. I mean, infantry, armor, artillery, air defense, air power, another kind of thing to produce effects. And you need not only employ them individually, but to synchronize everything in time and place, because modern operations, they took place in a great width and in great depths. And only when everything is synchronized, you have results. That is the reason because Russians don't have a major results, because they have weaponry, but they can't synchronize everything to this extent to produce results. There is, of course, one ultimate weaponry, and it's nuclear weaponry, but there is a lot of downsides when you employ it, both ecological and both political, because there is a lot of political price attached with breaching nuclear taboo. And that is the reason why Russia is only like threatening with nuclear weaponry from time to time, but not employing it. Because even India and China, which are Russian leaning, pretending to be neutral, they said that breaching nuclear taboo is non-starter for them. That's why even this ultimate weaponry is not that ultimate. Well, if we are looking at the developments from the 24th of February 2022, we can see indeed the progress in terms of weaponry provided, but the story is a bit more complicated. We have we had on our own a lot of heavy equipment, especially artillery. We increased the share of artillery in armed forces in 8 years before the big war. And we have the biggest like inheritance from the USSR, and not only of arm or artillery, but also air defense and combat planes. And that's why when Russians were not able to establish their superiority in the first days of this war, for Ukrainian side, it was artillery war all along, not from the mid of April, as it's said, it is depicted. So artillery proved its role in all the major battles. So in the defense of northern Ukraine, in defense of Kharkiv, in defense of along the joint forces operation in Donbass and so on. So it's artillery war from the day one for the Ukrainian side, and only like in combination everything worked. For sure, light weaponry had its role, as Russian columns were overstretched, their logistics was vulnerable, they were moving on the major roads, they didn't have a density of troops to create a continuous front line. It means there were holes we exploited with light anti-tank weaponry, but the picture is more complicated. When provision of HIMARS was adopted, it indeed a turning point, because when they started to be employed at the end of June, they did a major service for Ukraine, because Russians, they operated from the assumption that Ukrainians don't have like a lot of in-depth strike capability beyond the range of like 30 kilometers. And when the capability arrived that is able to strike 85 kilometers pinpoint strikes, relying on military GPS, for sure it did a major harm for Russians. We employed it asymmetrically, because to tell you the truth, when the issue of HIMARS MLRS was discussed, I thought that we're going to employ them for counter battery strike to destroy like artillery pieces and so on. So, but we employed it asymmetrically against warhouses first and foremost, and it produced a major result, because we were able to arrest Russian artillery advances in the middle of the last summer. And then also the system proved instrumental in liberating Kharkiv region and in liberating Western Kherson region. But then, as we saw, Russians adjusted. I mean, they withdraw their warhouses beyond the range of HIMARS. They withdraw their command and control nodes beyond the range. I mean, major one. Of course, minor ones are still there, but major ones. So it means that this is the reason why Ukrainians are asking about short-range ballistic missiles of ATACMS type. That's the reason why we're asking Taurus air-launched cruise missile. And that is the reason why we appreciate UK provided Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile with a range of 250 kilometers and 450 kilogram warhead that is able to destroy more hardened targets. So Russians are also adjusting. It means that we need different kind of weaponry, but there is no ultimate weaponry. And only when a lot of different branches and arms are aligned, we can have proper results on the battlefield, both in defense and in offense.
Well, that is an amazing perspective. Thank you for that. My last question would be, how do you expect this summer campaign will end? Will we see the Ukrainian victory this year?
It depends what people mean by Ukrainian victory. So people in Ukraine mostly define victory in terms of liberating territories. There is this phrasing that we need to recover all temporary lost territories and restore our borders that are recognized by United Nations countries, except Russia. Alas, it is still UN country. So that is this framing. It is right, but only to the certain extent. Because first, alas, we were not provided with equipment and capabilities to liberate all the territories. So what we can conceive realistically is one major offensive to liberate like southern Ukraine. But we don't have the capability and the capacity to liberate all 18% of temporary lost territories. That is the first thing. The second thing, even if we imagine the situation when all the territories are recovered, including temporary lost Crimea, it doesn't guarantee that Russia, especially Russia under Putin, would accept independent, sovereign, and democratic Ukraine. And quite the opposite. I mean, till Putin is in power, there is no reason to think that he would reconcile with independent Ukraine. It means that even if we can recover all the territories with one strike, with one major strike, which is highly unlikely for the reasons I described, it doesn't mean that, well, Ukrainian security would be guaranteed and peace and stability would be attained in Europe. In terms of what it means to have a victory, we can refer to wise German theoretician Karl von Clausewitz. He was an officer who went through Napoleonic Wars, but he was a very wise man, intellectual, the father of the ontology of war, and he framed the victory not in military terms, but in political terms. So the most important thing, the most important marker of Ukrainian success, and the moment we can say that Ukraine prevailed, international community prevailed, when Russian elite or Russian people are reconciled with Ukrainian independence. Not trying to do the same horrible things they did since 2014, and especially since 24th of February 2022. That is the reason why Ukraine is so eager to get NATO membership ASAP, because it means that there would be no major space for Russia to project its imperial delusions. Strategic defeat of Russia, it only can be done with a NATO membership to deprive Russia of the space to project its delusions, and finally to push them for the post-imperial transition. Because despite the fact that USSR collapsed almost 32 years ago, Russia didn't went through this post-imperial transition, and only when it goes through the post-imperial transition, and a major sign of its success would be acceptance of Ukrainian independence, we can say that Ukraine and countries who stand behind Ukraine, aid Ukraine, they finally prevailed and did their job. Before this, it can only be a temporary respite, alas.
Thank you so much for your deep insight. How can we achieve stable peace in Europe? How can the Ukrainian victory be stable and strategic and final? That is a great interview with Mykola Bielieskov. He is a security analyst at the Ukrainian Institute for Strategic Studies. We had our talk from Kyiv. Thank you so much and have a great day.